In the summer of 2004, General Motors did something that, at the time, felt almost reckless. They took the most recognizable feature of the Corvette, the pop-up headlights that had defined the silhouette of every model since 1963, and quietly threw them in the bin. The result, unveiled for the 2005 model year, was the C6. And the moment it was revealed, the reaction split almost cleanly down the middle. Half the enthusiast world said Chevrolet had finally built a real world-class sports car. The other half accused them of betraying the soul of the nameplate. And that tension, that quiet civil war between Corvette purists and Corvette progressives, would define the next 8 years of the car's life. But to understand why the C6 mattered, you have to understand the corner Chevrolet had painted itself into by the early 2000s. The C5 had been a triumph in engineering, a clean sheet design that finally gave the Corvette a chassis worthy of its powertrain. It was fast, it was relatively refined, and it was, by Corvette standards, almost European in its competence. But it still looked, to put it kindly, like a car designed by committee in 1996. The interior felt like it had been assembled from a J.C. Whitney catalog. And in a world where Porsche was building the 996, BMW was selling the E46 M3, and Nissan was about to drop the R35 GR. The C5 was beginning to feel like a very fast museum piece. So when GM started planning the C6, they made a decision that, on paper, sounds almost obvious. Make it smaller, make it tighter, and make it look like something a grown adult could park in front of a nice restaurant without flinching. And that is where things get interesting, because the C6 was not actually a clean sheet redesign. It was built on the same wide-body architecture as the C5, sharing the hydroformed steel perimeter frame, the transaxle layout, and most of the suspension geometry. In other words, the C6 was, in mechanical terms, a heavily refined C5, which sounds like a cost-cutting move until you look closer. By keeping the bones of a car that was already considered one of the best-handling sports cars in the world, GM freed up its budget to obsess over the things that had always made the Corvette feel cheap. The body became 5 inches shorter, the track widened, the wheelbase actually grew, which is the kind of geometric witchcraft that usually only happens when an engineer is allowed to ignore a marketing department for about 6 months. Under the hood sat the LS2, a 6.0-liter small block making 400 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque. It was an evolution of the LS1, but with a larger displacement, a higher compression ratio, and a freer breathing intake. It was, by any objective measure, a deeply unfashionable engine. It used pushrods in an era when every serious performance car had moved to overhead cams. It had 2 valves per cylinder when the rest of the industry was running for 1, and it weighed less than almost any V8 on the market. Critics, especially the European motoring press, called it agricultural. They were not entirely wrong, but that assumption ignores something important. The LS2 produced its torque almost everywhere in the rev range, sounded like distant artillery, and weighed about the same as a modern 4-cylinder. Bolted to a 6-speed manual or a Tremec-sourced gearbox, it gave the C6 a 0 to 60 time of around 4.2 seconds, which, in 2005, was Ferrari 360 territory for less than half the price. And, on paper, that should have been enough. But the C6 story was just getting started. In 2006, Chevrolet released the Z06, and this is where the conversation around the C6 stopped being about value and started being about engineering. The Z06 was not just a hotter version of the base car. It was, in many ways, an entirely different machine wearing the same shape. The chassis was rebuilt around an aluminum frame, shaving roughly 130 pounds. The fenders were widened to swallow larger wheels. The rear axle was strengthened. The brakes were upgraded to enormous cross-drilled discs. And in the engine bay sat the LS7, a 7.0-liter, naturally aspirated V8 with titanium connecting rods, a dry sump oiling system, and 505 horsepower. It was, and still is, the largest displacement small-block Chevrolet has ever put into a production car. And it was hand-assembled in Wixom, Michigan, by a small team of engine builders who signed each one. The Z06 weighed 3,130 pounds. For context, a contemporary Porsche 911 Turbo weighed about 3,500, a Ferrari F430 weighed about 3,200. The Z06 was lighter than both, faster than both in a straight line, and cost roughly $70,000, which, in performance car terms, was almost an insult. And yet, the press was not uniformly kind. The interior was still plasticky. The ride was punishing. The traction control was, depending on which magazine you read, either inadequate or actively dangerous. Car and Driver famously crashed one during testing. Top Gear made jokes about the build quality, and the European press, in particular, seemed almost personally offended that an American car using ancient technology could embarrass cars costing 3 times as much. But here's what the criticism misunderstood. The C6 Z06 was never trying to be a Porsche. It was not trying to be a refined, neutral, surgical instrument. It was trying to be the fastest possible car that an enthusiast could buy, maintain, and modify without taking out a second mortgage. And, by that metric, nothing else on the market in 2006 was even close. Then, in 2009, Chevrolet did something that, in retrospect, feels almost out of character. They released the Z, powered by the LS9, a 6.2-liter supercharged V8 producing 638 horsepower. The Z1 was the first Corvette to crack the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. It had carbon ceramic brakes, magnetic ride control, a carbon fiber roof, and a transparent polycarbonate window in the hood so you could actually see the supercharger. It cost just over $100,000, which was, by Corvette standards, almost obscene. And it lapped the Nürburgring in 7 minutes and 26 seconds, faster than the Ferrari Enzo, faster than the Porsche Carrera GT, faster than almost any production car in the world at that moment. And this is where opinions split, because for some enthusiasts, the ZR1 was the moment the Corvette finally stopped apologizing for itself. It was a halo car, a statement, proof that GM could build something genuinely world-class when it actually tried. For others, the Z1 was the beginning of the end. The moment the Corvette stopped being the everyman supercar and started becoming something more aspirational, more expensive, and less connected to the working-class enthusiast that had defined the brand. Both opinions, in their own way, were correct. But why does this matter? Why, in 2026, are we still talking about a car that ended production over a decade ago? The answer has very little to do with horsepower numbers or lap times. It has to do with what the C6 represented in the broader arc of the American sports car. The C6 was the last Corvette built primarily by engineers, for engineers, with the expectation that the buyer would be someone who actually understood and appreciated what they were sitting in. It was the last Corvette you could option with a manual transmission across every trim level. It was the last Corvette where the front engine, rear transaxle layout felt like a deliberate philosophical choice rather than a holdover. And it was the last Corvette before the C7 began the slow march toward refinement. Before the C8 abandoned the front engine layout entirely, in other words, the C6 was the end of a lineage that stretched back to 1953. Every Corvette before it had shared a basic recipe: big V8 up front, rear-wheel drive, 2 seats, and the assumption that the driver knew what they were doing. The C6 perfected that recipe, and then, quietly, it was retired. There is also the matter of Corvette racing, because while the road car was being debated in magazines, the C6R, the racing version of the same chassis, was quietly dominating endurance racing on 3 continents. It won its class at LA Mans multiple times. It won the American LA Mans Series Championship year after year. It beat factory-backed efforts from Ferrari, Aston Martin, BMW, and Porsche, often with a fraction of the budget. And it did all of this using essentially the same architecture you could buy at a Chevrolet dealership, which, when you think about it, is a kind of motorsport story that simply does not exist anymore. Today, the C6 occupies a strange and increasingly valuable space in the used market. Base models can still be found for under $20,000, which is, considering what they offer, almost suspicious. Z06 prices have started climbing as collectors realize that the LS7 is unlikely to ever be built again. Zerwan values have stabilized at a level that suggests the market has finally decided it was, in fact, a serious car. And Grand Sport models, which combined the wide body of the Z06 with the LS3 powertrain of the base car, have become the connoisseur's choice, the version that purists quietly recommend when nobody else is listening. The C6, in the end, was a car that asked a very simple question. What if America stopped trying to imitate Europe? Stopped apologizing for pushrods and plastic interiors, and just built the fastest, most honest sports car it possibly could? The answer, it turned out, was a car that could embarrass a Ferrari, win at Le Mans, and still be driven to work on a Tuesday. Whether that makes it the greatest Corvette ever built is a debate that will probably never end. But what is harder to argue is that the C6 was the last Corvette of its kind. The last one built before the rules changed, before the layout changed, before the audience changed. And in a world that increasingly values refinement over character, that alone might be the most interesting thing about it.